Hello and welcome back, everybody, to another podcast. I'm super excited to be here today with Tyler Milfeld, Courtney B. Peters, and Jennifer H. Tatara talking about the recent article in JAR. This is titled Fueling or Suppressing Brand Activism Backlash: How Message Type Differentially Influences Perceived Hypocrisy and Consumer Attitudes. So, thank you so much, Tyler, Courtney, and Jennifer, for being on today.
Thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here.
Excellent. So, for those people who may not have gone through and had a chance to take a look at your exciting article, could you give us a quick overview of what it is you're going through and investigating and how it is you went through and took a look at that?
Sure. So, for those of you who have not read the full article, we recommend that you do because we think there's a lot of really good stuff here that's also very contemporary. So, this article picks up on the heels of a lot of research on brand activism. So, brands taking a stance on a socio-political issue. And there's some phenomenal research, including in our favorite journal, JAR, about how consumers respond when brands take a stand. And the overarching consensus is that brand activism generates some negative attitudes toward the sponsoring brand. And like I said, there's a bunch of studies that have shown that. So our research picks up on the heels of that to say, okay, now that there is this negative sentiment against a brand that takes a stand, which we call brand activism backlash. So the wave of negative sentiment against a brand when it takes a stand, brands often respond. And typically, one of the things that they do is they retract their stance. They say, wait a second, we hear this backlash. Just kidding. We didn't really mean it. We're going to withdraw our product. We're going to take the ad off the air, whatever it might be. So, one of the things that we found, which we think is super interesting, is that what brands most often do, what we call retraction, is the least optimal strategy from a communication standpoint. So, when you look at some other strategies, such as doing nothing at all, or even doubling down, which we call reaffirming, are much better and generate much lower perceptions of hypocrisy than the most common brand response. Interestingly enough, we also found that at the individual level, so those who initially supported the issue, whatever stance that the brand had taken, also tend to kind of punish the brand the most when they retract that particular message. So what's happening is when a brand decides to retract their stance, you're fueling the fire amongst those who not only initially supported the issue, but also those who did not support the issue as well.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, you don't placate the people who were annoyed, and you actually annoy the people who were happy in the beginning, right?
Yes, yes. So that's why we like the expression you fuel the fire because now you've angered the folks who initially supported you and the folks who weren't on board to begin with still haven't come around. So it creates this cauldron, if you will, of negative sentiment toward the brand, which is now exacerbated from the original brand activism message.
Wow. Yeah. So very, very important then. Yeah. In terms of like for brands, I mean, I guess the obvious implication is to not go through and actually retract their statements, but I'm guessing there's probably more nuance as well in terms of the advice you have for how brands should employ these results.
Yeah, so one of like the biggest takeaways is that, for people working in advertising, how you respond to backlash requires just as much thought and strategy as taking that stand initially in the first place. And a lot of brands assume that, when a campaign starts getting heat, the safest move is to pull back. And as Tyler said, that really backfires. So we need to fight that urge to retract support for a cause. Makes you look like a hypocrite to those who supported the original stance. We're thinking about this like these are our most engaged, value line customers. And when we reverse course, we're letting them down and we're not helping those who oppose the situation. And then that sense of hypocrisy is going to spill over into more negative brand attitudes. So, as Tyler said, we're not calming any storm. We're actually pouring gasoline on it and making it much worse. So, We need to be aware that there are defensive approaches. What we're looking at is things like reaffirming the original stance or even saying nothing at all. That can perform better in this context. And that sounds, counterintuitive to not say anything at all. But that actually performed really similarly to doubling down. So reaffirming is that more bold choice, but our research suggests that saying nothing at all in response to the backlash is an effective strategy as it implicitly shows support that we're continuing on as normal and continuing to support our cause. Another takeaway for managers here is that even though the negative sentiment surrounding the backlash is a crisis, it's scary to have that happen. We're in that crisis mode. This is different than traditional crisis communication. So brand activism backlash doesn't necessarily require that apology and fix, put the band-aid on type of response. So for advertisers, this means you can't just apply the standard crisis, playbook here. The brand activism backlash requires its own set of strategy. And, to your point, Colin, we're saying don't retract, but we understand that in some situations you have to go back, right? We're not saying you can never take anything back. And we did find some strategy there that if a brand does need to retract, a solution is to offer a basic need justification. So what we mean by that is something like employee safety or customer safety. That can give people a reason that feels more legitimate. It's human. We can understand that, rather than, increase those perceptions of hypocrisy or look kind of opportunistic. So there is a way that, we can retract, if we have to. I think ultimately the big lesson here, for practitioners is don't rush to retract a social issue campaign. I feel like with social media, it's so easy to just be like, oh, sorry, we're taking it back. So don't rush into that. Think carefully about who you're trying to protect. Recognize, the value, consistency, and credibility of the people who believe in you, those high issue support customers. And, think about that brand activism. It's not just about taking the stand, but it's also about finding the ways to stand by that. And you can continue to stand by it by doubling down, reaffirming your support, or even just not feeding into the negative stuff that's going on online.
That's super cool. Yeah, I imagine a question could be, how might a manager know when to say nothing versus like when to double down? So I'm curious if any sort of suggestions around that, even if you didn't explore it, or any sort of insights on when they might choose one versus the other, or is it just kind of they're quite equivalent?
Yeah, I think if that initial campaign is in line with your values, we talk on the paper, and there's a lot of other research, great research that shows that it's in brand activism is divisive. There's always going to be backlash. So I think it's a little bit par for course. You're going to get some of that backlash. If it's, and I think that's unsettling for managers to sit with that, but there is an importance in kind of sitting with that backlash. Obviously, if it's turning into more of a crisis, in terms of the longevity of that, I think that's something interesting to explore is the volume and longevity of how long that backlash ensues. But learning to sit with it because you should expect it and get it, and fight that urge to just instantly respond.
Cool. Yeah. I'm curious as well too. So, especially given your topic, where did your idea for researching this come from? Was one of you like very angered by an issue you saw in an ad or something, or did it come from some other place? What's the story behind this? Yeah.
So, Jenny and Tyler have already kind of alluded to this. I wouldn't say any of us were necessarily angered by it, but we did see what was happening with some like real world examples where brands were quickly walking back their purpose advertising or brand activism campaigns. We made the assumption that these brands probably believed that retraction would actually calm the situation. But what we saw play out was that media coverage, public reaction, social media suggested quite the opposite, and that these reversals were actually making things a lot worse. So we started kind of digging into this. We're all interested. Jenny really likes looking into corporate apologies. Tyler's in the purpose advertising space, and I am interested in brand activism for the most part. And so we really started digging into the literature to kind of look at, what is going on in this space? What are we recommending to managers, to advertisers to do? And what we found was that most of the brand activism literature focuses on that initial decision to engage in brand activism, whereas there's not much out there about what do you do in response to the backlash after you have taken a stand. Because, like Jenny said, um, brand activism tends to be divisive. That's kind of par for the course with brand activism. And so, what do you do when you do get that backlash? So, that gap in how do you begin to respond after that backlash was really where we wanted to situate this research project.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah. I'm also curious as well too for every article like about the challenges that people maybe don't see behind the scenes, or any sort of issues or things like that you might have dealt with or had to overcome in the service of coming up with the article.
Sure. I would say there are a couple challenges here. One of the first ones was as we started to dig deeper into the literature and then we got back the results. One of the things that we noticed is that it doesn't quite map to traditional crisis response strategies. And a huge shout out to Jenny, who's an expert on crisis management. So if there are any practitioners out there, any brands, any influencers who are dealing with a crisis, call Jenny because she knows this literature inside and out and can recommend some great things. But that aside, like it became very apparent to us that a traditional crisis is very different than a brand activism backlash crisis. And some of the strategies that work in that first arena don't really work here. So we
Mm,
started to think about that framework. We looked at the accommodative kind of versus defensive strategies, and then tried to kind of piece it all together, all the way thinking about like, well, why is this different, and why are some of these strategies different? So there was a ton of reflection and a ton of research on our side, just trying to figure out the differences between traditional crises and brand activism crises. And we think that's a really cool piece of this paper too, is that
that
what
is,
brands
yeah.
traditionally do isn't necessarily the most effective, and it is a different type of crisis. From a research standpoint, I think one of the other challenges was how do you manipulate doing nothing, right? When you think from an experimental standpoint,
True.
how do
Yeah.
you come up with a scenario where a brand literally says nothing, does nothing about that particular event? So we did a ton of brainstorming, and I think landed in a pretty good spot. We came up with scenarios and made sure the participant was aware that there was this crisis. So we made the crisis salient, and then that there was this, there was a little bit of a lag, but this is what you will see next from that particular sponsoring brand. And of course, ran all the manipulation checks to make sure that what we thought we were doing worked out well.
Mm,
But I think that was also a cool addition to this too, is that we looked through some literature and testing different things, and that became a really good way to test that particular message strategy. So I think those two are probably some of the biggest challenges that we encountered along the way, but I think they were really fun challenges because it allows this paper to contribute to the ad discourse in some very different ways.
yeah, that is quite neat. And I like that distinction between these different types of crises, especially. I've never really thought about that before this one. So that's cool. Yeah. Um, Final question is I'm going through and thinking about where to next. So, given how fresh this is in this perspective, I'm sure you have many ideas, but I'm wondering what are some of the top, paths forward or interesting areas you think people should take a look at next, whether maybe it's yourselves as well too. Yeah.
Yeah, so we could probably talk for hours on just ideas alone in this area, but I'll try to keep it short. Probably for us, really digging in and building out the backlash literature. What happens? What are the different scenarios? What are appropriate response strategies? And really digging in further to these findings that we have here. I think is really important going forward to understand that there are appropriate ways to respond. We're also interested in more so not just when brands take that initial stance and then face the backlash, but what happens if a brand walks away from a social issue altogether if they've previously supported it? So looking at, you know, when is it okay to do that? Is it okay? How do you do it if you no longer want to support a specific issue? So those are kind of two main areas stemming specifically from these findings that I think we'll probably dig into in the future. And I think there's plenty of room in this area to come up with tons of research ideas.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. And for those who are interested, again, the title of the article is Fueling or Suppressing Brand Activism Backlash: How Message Type Differentially Influences Perceived Hypocrisy and Consumer Attitudes. And this came out in the December 2025 issue of JAR. So anyone can take a look at it there. Yeah, thank you again so much, Courtney, Jenny, and Tyler, for coming on and sharing more about your article. It's been a complete pleasure hearing about it.
Likewise, thanks, Colin.
Yes, thanks, Colin. It's been great.
Of course. Awesome. That was fantastic. Yeah, really nice.